German pilots had a name for it: Zerstörer, destroyer. It was a name born of confidence, ambition, and a vision of the future. In the early days of World War II, this aircraft seemed unstoppable, a technological marvel that would sweep the skies clean of enemies. But as the war turned against Germany, the hunter became the hunted. This is the story of the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and how a revolutionary concept faced the ultimate test in the desperate skies over the Reich. Spring 1936, Augsburg, Germany. While Europe enjoyed its last years of uneasy peace, Professor Willy Messerschmitt was designing something the Luftwaffe had never possessed. The RLM, the Reich Air Ministry, had issued a requirement that seemed impossible: a heavy fighter, a Zerstörer, that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, fight its way through interceptors, and still have the range to return home. It needed to be fast, heavily armed, and capable of operating independently far from friendly territory. In 1936, this was visionary thinking. No air force in the world had successfully fielded such an aircraft. The solution required two engines, long range, and devastating firepower. The concept wasn't entirely new. The idea of heavy fighters had been discussed since the First World War. But technology had finally caught up with theory. New engines, new materials, new understanding of aerodynamics made it possible to build an aircraft that could fulfill this ambitious vision. The Luftwaffe wasn't alone in pursuing this concept. The British were developing the Westland Whirlwind. The Americans would later create the P-38 Lightning. But in 1936, Germany was leading the way. Messerschmitt's answer was the Bf 110. Twin Daimler-Benz engines mounted on a sleek fuselage. A glazed nose for a radio operator who also manned a rear-facing machine gun for defense. And in the nose, concentrated forward-facing armament that could shred enemy aircraft. 4 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns and 2 20mm MG-FF cannons. This was more firepower than any fighter aircraft in service anywhere in the world. The weight of fire from all 6 weapons firing simultaneously was devastating. When the prototype first flew on May 12, 1936, test pilots were impressed. The Bf 110 V1, as the prototype was designated, handled well despite its size. It was fast, reaching speeds over 300 miles per hour, faster than most single-engine fighters of the day. The Luftwaffe was ecstatic. They had their Zerstörer. This was the future of aerial warfare. But the design wasn't without compromises. Twin engines meant weight. The Bf 110 weighed nearly twice as much as a Bf 109 single-engine fighter. Weight meant less maneuverability than single-engine fighters. In a turning fight, physics was unforgiving. The heavier aircraft had a larger turning radius. It couldn't follow a lighter, more agile opponent through tight maneuvers. The Bf 110 could outrun most opponents in a straight line, but in a turning fight, it was vulnerable. This would become critical, but in 1936, German planners believed speed and firepower would overcome any deficiency in agility. They envisioned the Zerstörer as a strategic weapon. It would fly ahead of bomber formations, clearing the skies of enemy fighters. It would hunt down enemy bombers attempting to attack German targets. It would provide long-range reconnaissance and ground attack capabilities. They were building an aircraft for the future of warfare, or so they thought. Development wasn't without problems. Early prototypes suffered from engine cooling issues. The rear gunner position proved cramped and difficult to operate effectively. The aircraft's handling at slow speeds required careful attention from pilots, but these issues were addressed through testing and modification. By 1938, the Bf 110 was entering production, and the first operational units were forming. The pilots selected for the Zerstörer units were among the Luftwaffe's best. These weren't rookies fresh from training. They were experienced aviators, many of whom had flown in the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War. The radio operators and gunners were also highly trained specialists. Crewing a Bf 110 required teamwork and coordination that single-seat fighters didn't demand. The pilot and radio operator had to function as a team, communicating constantly, watching each other's backs. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Bf 110 equipped several Zerstörer-Geschwader, specialized wings of these heavy fighters. Zerstörer-Geschwader 1, 26, and 76 were operational, with more units forming. In Poland, they performed brilliantly. Polish fighters, primarily PZLP 11S and P7S, were outdated biplanes and early monoplanes. They were slow, lightly armed, and no match for the Bf 110's speed and firepower. The Bf 110 crews hunted Polish aircraft with impunity. They swept in fast, their concentrated nose armament shredding Polish fighters before the defenders could react. They strafed Polish airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. They provided close air support for advancing German ground forces. The crews returned with glowing reports. The concept was validated. The Zerstörer was invincible. Hauptmann Wolfgang Falk, flying with Zerstörer-Geschwader 1, shot down several Polish aircraft during the campaign. He was impressed by the Bf 110's performance. The speed, the firepower, the range, all exceeded expectations. Falk became convinced the aircraft was the future of the Luftwaffe. He would later play a crucial role in the Bf 110's evolution, but in September 1939, he was simply a young officer, proving a new weapon in combat. The Polish campaign lasted barely a month. German forces overwhelmed Polish defenses, and the Bf 110 units emerged with minimal losses and maximum confidence. The few Bf 100s that were lost fell primarily to ground fire, not enemy fighters. This reinforced the belief that the Zerstörer could dominate any opponent in the air. There was a brief period of relative quiet during the winter of 1939 to 1940, the so-called Phony War. Bf 110 units continued training, refining tactics, preparing for the next campaign. More aircraft rolled off production lines. More crews completed training. The Zerstörer force was expanding, and morale was sky high. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Bf 110 units participated, providing air cover for the invasion forces and engaging Norwegian aircraft. Again, the opposition was minimal and outdated. Norwegian fighters stood no chance against the Bf 110's superior speed and armament. The aircraft's long range proved valuable in the vast Norwegian theater, allowing missions deep into the country to support isolated German forces. Then, in May 1940, came the main event: the invasion of France and the Low Countries. The Bf 110 would spearhead the Luftwaffe's assault, clearing the skies for German bombers and ground attack aircraft. This was what the Zerstörer had been designed for. In the spring of 1940, the Bf 110 spearheaded the assault on France and the Low Countries. Again, it dominated. French Morane Saulnier, M. S-406, Ez and Bloch, MB-152Es, and British Hurricanes and Gladiators struggled against the combination of speed, range, and concentrated firepower. The Bf 110 units claimed hundreds of victories during the brief campaign. The tactics were refined through combat experience. Bf 110 formations would sweep ahead of German bomber formations, engaging any Allied fighters that attempted to intercept. Their speed allowed them to choose when to fight. If they encountered superior numbers, they could often outrun pursuers. If they had the advantage, their firepower was decisive. Oberleutnant Helmut Lent, who would become one of Germany's highest-scoring night fighter aces, flew Bf 100s during the French campaign with Zerstörer 1. He described the exhilaration of these early missions. The Bf 110 felt invincible. Allied fighters seemed slow and poorly armed by comparison. German pilots attacked with confidence, knowing their aircraft had every advantage. Major Wolfgang Falk flew missions over the Low Countries in France, racking up victories and becoming increasingly convinced that the Bf 110 was the future of the Luftwaffe. The aircraft's versatility impressed him. It could fight, it could escort, it could attack ground targets. What more could anyone want from a fighter aircraft? But there were warning signs that few noticed. When Bf 100s encountered modern Spitfires and Hurricanes flown by experienced RAF pilots, the combat was more even. British pilots who survived encounters with Bf 100s noted that while the German aircraft was fast and heavily armed, it wasn't particularly maneuverable. If you could force it into a turning fight, you had a chance. These encounters were rare during the French campaign. The RAF was overwhelmed, fighting desperately to cover the evacuation at Dunkirk and protect British forces. The Luftwaffe had numerical superiority and the initiative. Bf 110 units suffered some losses, but nothing that seemed alarming. The campaign ended in triumph. France fell in 6 weeks. The Bf 110 units had performed excellently. Production was accelerated. More Zerstörer were formed. The German High Command was planning the next operation, the invasion of Britain. For this, air superiority was essential. The Luftwaffe would have to destroy the Royal Air Force, particularly Fighter Command. And the Bf 110, the invincible Zerstörer, would lead the way. Then came Britain, August 1940. The Battle of Britain began in earnest. The Luftwaffe launched its campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was confident. His forces had swept aside every opponent they'd faced. The RAF would be no different. The Bf 110 units crossed the Channel with confidence, expecting another easy victory. They flew in large formations, grouping of 30 or more aircraft, dark shapes against the summer sky. Their targets were RAF airfields, radar stations, and any British fighters they encountered. They expected to find an enemy already demoralized by defeat in France, short of aircraft and pilots, ready to collapse. Instead, they flew into a nightmare. The Spitfire and Hurricane pilots of Fighter Command had different ideas. These single-engine fighters, defending their homeland, were flown by desperate men who knew they were fighting for survival. They had one critical advantage. They could turn inside the Bf 100s. And they had another advantage the Germans hadn't fully appreciated. They were fighting over home territory, guided by an integrated radar and ground control system that allowed them to intercept German formations with devastating efficiency. The first major daylight raids were catastrophic for the Zerstörer units. RAF fighters would bounce the Bf 110 formations from above and behind, diving out of the sun. In the turning dogfights that followed, the heavy German fighters were slaughtered. A Spitfire or Hurricane could turn inside the Bf 110's turning circle, getting on its tail and staying there. The rear gunner's single machine gun was inadequate defense against a determined attacker with 8 machine guns or 4 cannons. Bf 110 pilots tried to use their speed to escape, but RAF pilots learned to work in pairs. One would engage from the front, forcing the Bf 110 to turn and lose speed. The second would attack from behind as the German aircraft slowed. It was a deadly tactic, and it worked. On August 15, 1940, during what the Germans called Black Thursday, the Luftwaffe launched massive raids against targets across southern England. Zerstörer 76 was decimated. The unit lost 16 aircraft in a single day. 16 aircraft. 32 highly trained crewmen, dead or captured. The losses were staggering, unthinkable. Survivors told horror stories of being attacked by swarms of British fighters, of watching their comrades shot down in flames, of barely escaping back across the channel with shot-up aircraft and wounded crew members. The psychological impact was devastating. These men had been told they were flying invincible aircraft. They had been promised air superiority. Now they were dying. The Bf 110 pilots tried desperate measures. They formed defensive circles, each aircraft protecting the tail of the one ahead. The defensive circle was a tactic born of desperation. When bounced by RAF fighters, the Bf 100s would turn into a continuous circle, each aircraft's rear gunner covering the tail of the aircraft ahead. In theory, any attacking fighter would have to cross through defensive fire to reach its target. But Spitfires would simply climb above these formations and dive through, picking off stragglers. Or they would attack from the sides, exploiting gaps in the defensive fire. The defensive circle might delay the inevitable, but it couldn't prevent it. And while flying in a defensive circle, the Bf 100s couldn't accomplish their mission. They were neutralized as an offensive weapon. Worse still, the defensive circle was an admission of failure. These aircraft had been designed to attack, to destroy enemy fighters, to dominate the skies. Now they were flying in circles just to survive. The humiliation was profound. Pilot morale collapsed. Men who had been confident and aggressive in Poland and France now flew with dread. Every mission across the Channel was a potential death sentence. Some pilots developed stress-related illnesses. Others simply froze up in combat, unable to react effectively when attacked. The Zerstörer force was breaking. By September 1940, the unthinkable happened. Bf 100s, which were supposed to escort bombers, themselves required escort by Bf 109 single-engine fighters. The Zerstörer concept seemed to have failed completely. The aircraft designed to protect bombers needed protection itself. It was absurd, humiliating, and undeniable. Goering was furious. He berated Bf 110 pilots, accusing them of cowardice. This was spectacularly unfair. These men were flying obsolete tactics in unsuitable conditions, paying for mistakes made by their commanders. But Goering needed scapegoats, and the Zerstörer force was convenient. Some Luftwaffe officers advocated abandoning the type entirely. Resources were limited. Why continue producing an aircraft that had proven vulnerable? Why not focus on Bf-109s, which were clearly superior? Production was nearly canceled. The Bf-110 seemed destined for history's dustbin, a failed experiment. But a few officers, Wolfgang Falk among them, believed the Bf-110 still had value. The problem wasn't the aircraft itself, they argued. The problem was how it was being used. Daylight fighter combat against modern single-engine fighters wasn't playing to the Bf-110's strengths. But what if it operated in different conditions? What if it fought at night? The idea wasn't entirely new. As the Battle of Britain transitioned from daylight raids to night bombing, the Blitz, both sides struggled with night combat. Bombers could operate with relative impunity in darkness. Fighters had trouble finding them. Ground-based searchlights and anti-aircraft guns were the primary defense, and they were inadequate. The British were experimenting with night fighters, equipping Blenheim light bombers with early airborne radar. The technology was primitive, unreliable, and marginally effective. But it proved the concept. With radar, a night fighter could find bombers in darkness. The Germans began experimenting with their own night fighter force, and the Bf-110, despite its failures in daylight combat, was perfect for this role. The aircraft's two engines provided reliability for long night patrols. Engine failure at night, over hostile territory or water, was a death sentence in a single-engine fighter. In a Bf-110, you might make it home. The spacious fuselage could accommodate early radar equipment and a dedicated radar operator. The radio operator position, which had proven less useful than hoped in daylight combat, could be converted into a radar operator station. The concentrated nose armament was devastating in the brief firing opportunities night combat provided, and the aircraft's endurance meant it could patrol for hours, waiting for interceptions. In late 1940, Major Wolfgang Falk was given command of the first dedicated night fighter unit, Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, equipped with Bf-100s and 10s. Falk was the right man for the job. He believed in the aircraft, understood its capabilities and limitations, and was willing to experiment with new tactics and technologies. The early months were frustrating. Radar technology was primitive. The Liechtenstein BC radar, the first airborne radar deployed in Bf-110 night fighters, had a maximum range of about 2 miles under ideal conditions, often less. The radar operator, seated behind the pilot, would stare at a small screen showing blips of light that might be an enemy bomber, might be ground returns, might be spurious signals. Finding a bomber in the vast darkness of the night sky was like searching for a needle in a haystack. But gradually, tactics evolved. Ground controllers using radar would vector night fighters toward incoming bomber streams. Once the night fighter was in the general area, its airborne radar would search for individual bombers. The radar operator would guide his pilot, range, bearing, Altitude. The pilot would maneuver into position, usually below and behind the bomber, where defensive fire was minimal. Then came the critical moment. The pilot would visually acquire the target, a dark shape against the slightly lighter sky, or sometimes silhouetted against clouds or moonlight. He would close to point-blank range, sometimes less than 100 meters. Then he would fire. 4 machine guns and 2 cannons opening up simultaneously. The effect was catastrophic. Bombers would explode, break apart, or catch fire. Often, they fell without ever knowing what had hit them. By 1941, as the Luftwaffe turned east to invade the Soviet Union, the Bf 110 was being reborn. In the east, it found renewed success in daylight operations. Soviet fighters in the early months of Operation Barbarossa were largely obsolete. Polikarpov, 115 biplanes, and I-16 monoplanes were no match for the Bf 110's speed and firepower. German crews rediscovered the confidence they'd lost over Britain. The Bf 110 resumed its role as a Zerstörer in the east, devastating ground targets and clearing the skies of opposition. Bf 110 units flew ground attack missions, strafing Soviet airfields, convoys, and troop concentrations. The aircraft's ability to carry bombs and rockets made it effective in this role. The concentrated nose armament was devastating against soft targets. But increasingly, the Bf 110's primary role was shifting to the night skies over Germany. As 1941 turned to 1942, and 1942 turned to 1943, RAF Bomber Command was growing in strength and sophistication. British bombers were penetrating deeper into German territory, hitting industrial targets, cities, anything that could damage German war production. The night raids were devastating, and the German civilian population was suffering. The Bf 110 night fighters became Germany's primary defense. More units converted to the night fighter role. More aircraft were produced in night fighter configurations, with radar, flame dampers on the exhaust, and specialized equipment. Pilots and radar operators trained intensively, learning to work as teams in the darkness. The combined bomber offensive. This was the year the air war over Germany reached its peak intensity. American B-17s and B-24s pounded German cities by day, in massive formations protected by ever-increasing numbers of escort fighters. RAF Lancasters and Halifaxes struck by night, in bomber streams hundreds of aircraft strong. The Reich was burning, and the Luftwaffe fought desperately to stop it. The Bf 110 night fighters became the backbone of Germany's night air defense. Equipped with improved Liechtenstein SN2 radar that was less vulnerable to British countermeasures, and with Schrägemusik, upward-firing cannons, Bf 110 night fighters became the terror of RAF bomber streams. Schrägemusik, literally slanting music, or jazz in German slang, was a revelation. The concept was simple but brilliant. Mount cannons at an angle in the fuselage, pointing upward and forward. This allowed a night fighter to position itself directly beneath a bomber, in the blind spot where defensive fire couldn't reach, and fire upward into the most vulnerable parts of the target, the fuel tanks in the wings, and the bomb bay. The tactic was devastatingly effective. A Bf 110 with Schrägemusik could approach from below, invisible to the bomber's crew. The night fighter pilot would maneuver until he was directly beneath his target, so close he could see details of the bomber's underside in the darkness. Then he would fire, two 20-millimeter cannons firing upward. The shells would rip through aluminum, puncture fuel tanks, detonate bombs. Often, the bomber would explode before the crew even knew they were under attack. RAF bomber crews couldn't understand what was happening. They would see bombers ahead of them in the stream suddenly explode. No warning, no tracer fire, just a massive explosion. Initially, they thought these were German anti-aircraft shells designed to look like exploding bombers for psychological effect. They called them scarecrows. But the truth was worse than they imagined. The Bf 110 night fighters were destroying bombers with silent, deadly efficiency. And the British had no immediate counter. The bomber's defensive armament was designed for attacks from behind and the sides. The ventral gun position beneath the bomber was difficult to man and had limited fields of fire. The night fighters operating below were in a nearly perfect attack position. Major Heinz-Wolfgang Schnaufer became the highest-scoring night fighter ace of all time, with 121 confirmed victories, all but a handful in Bf 100s. He was a master of the night fighter art. Cool, methodical, technically proficient. His radar operator, Fritz Rumpelhart, was equally skilled. Together, they formed one of the most deadly teams in aviation history. On the night of February 21st, 1945, Schnaufer achieved what may be the most remarkable feat of night fighting in World War II. In a single sortie, lasting less than 5 hours, he shot down 9 RAF bombers. 9 heavy bombers with up to 7 crew members each. Potentially 63 men, destroyed by one Bf 110 in one night. The missions were carefully orchestrated. Ground control would alert Schnaufer's unit that a bomber stream was approaching. He would scramble, climbing to altitude while ground controllers vectored him toward the stream. Rumpelhart would scan with the radar, searching for targets. Once they had a contact, Schnaufer would close in, positioning beneath the bomber. Then he would fire. The bomber would explode or catch fire. Schnaufer would break away, and Rumpelhart would already be searching for the next target. 9 times that night, the process repeated. 9 bombers fell. Schnaufer's Bf 110 landed back at base with nearly empty fuel tanks and no ammunition. It was a stunning display of skill, teamwork, and the deadly efficiency of the night fighter system Germany had developed. But Schnaufer's achievement, impressive as it was, came in February 1945. Germany was collapsing. The war was lost. His 9 victories that night couldn't change the outcome. They were a footnote to a tragedy, remarkable in execution, but meaningless in strategic terms. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. Bf 110 crews, initially humiliated over Britain in 1940, found redemption and purpose in the night skies. They saw themselves as defenders of the Reich, protecting German cities from destruction. Many were decorated, celebrated in propaganda, treated as heroes. In German cities, civilians watched night fighters take off and knew these men were all that stood between them and the British bombers. Children collected photos of night fighter aces like boys everywhere, collected pictures of sports heroes. The propaganda machinery made much of their exploits. But the work itself was grim. Oberleutnant Martin Becker, who scored 58 night victories flying Bf 100s, recalled the horror of watching a Lancaster he'd hit break apart. Men tumbled from the wreckage, some on fire, falling thousands of feet to their deaths. He said it haunted him for the rest of his life. You tried not to think about it in the moment. You couldn't afford to. But afterward, on the ground, trying to sleep, the images would return. Becker kept flying, kept fighting. What else could he do? His cities were burning. Every night, RAF bombers dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries on German urban areas. Civilians were dying. If shooting down bombers meant killing British airmen, then that was the price. But it extracted its own cost from the men who did it. The bomber crews had their own trauma. RAF rear gunners, sitting alone in their turrets at the back of the aircraft, watched for night fighters. They knew that if they saw one, it was probably already too late. The night fighters attacked from below, where the gunners couldn't see them, or they attacked from behind, and by the time the gunners spotted them, they were already firing. Some gunners reported seeing distant explosions as other bombers in the stream were hit. They never knew if those explosions were from anti-aircraft fire, night fighters, or accidents. They just knew that one moment a bomber was there, and the next moment it was falling, burning, and they knew they could be next. The stress was unbearable. RAF bomber crews flew 30 mission tours. If you survived 30 missions, you were done. You'd beaten the odds. But the odds were terrible. At certain points in 1943 and 1944, the casualty rate was over 50%. More than half the men who started a tour wouldn't finish it. They'd be dead, or prisoners of war, or so badly wounded they couldn't continue. By 1944, the situation was becoming desperate for the German night fighters. The Allies had developed countermeasures that were increasingly effective. Window, strips of aluminum foil dropped by bombers, created clouds of false radar returns that blinded German radar, both ground-based and airborne. Entire sections of sky would bloom with false returns, making it nearly impossible to pick out individual bombers. German radar operators learned to look for characteristic patterns in the window clouds that might indicate actual bombers. They learned to use other sensors, like the FUG-227 Flensburg, which homed in on emissions from the Monica tail warning radars British bombers carried. It was a constant technological arms race. As soon as the Germans developed a countermeasure, the British would develop a counter to the countermeasure. The RAF also began deploying Mosquito night fighters to hunt the hunters. The de Havilland Mosquito was fast, maneuverable, and carried its own airborne radar. Mosquito pilots would patrol German airspace, searching for Bf 100s and other night fighters. When they found one, usually while the German aircraft was concentrating on attacking a bomber, the Mosquito would pounce. Many Bf 110 crews never knew what hit them. They were hunting bombers, and suddenly they were the prey. Hauptmann Martin Drews, a highly successful night fighter ace with 52 victories, described the unnerving experience of being hunted by mosquitoes. You're concentrating on the bomber ahead. Your radar operator is guiding you into position. You're seconds away from opening fire. Then suddenly, there's an explosion. Cannon shells ripping through your aircraft. Your first thought is anti-aircraft fire, but you're nowhere near a flat concentration. Then you realize there's a mosquito on your tail. If you're lucky, your aircraft is still flying and you can escape. If you're not lucky, you're burning and falling and hoping you can get out before you hit the ground. Drews survived several encounters with mosquitoes through skill, luck, and the durability of the Bf 110. Not all his comrades were as fortunate. Allied air superiority also meant German night fighters were vulnerable even taking off and landing. RAF intruders, mosquitoes, and other aircraft would prowl German airfields, waiting for night fighters to land after missions. The German aircraft, low on fuel, would be on their landing approach when the intruder would attack. Landing lights made perfect targets. Many Bf 100s were shot down within sight of their own airfields, their crews exhausted after hours of combat, thinking they were safe, then suddenly under attack in their most vulnerable moments. The Bf 110 units suffered terrible casualties through 1944. Training new crews became nearly impossible as fuel shortages intensified. The Luftwaffe was training pilots with minimal flying hours, radar operators with inadequate instruction. These inexperienced crews were being sent into combat against the RAF's bomber offensive, which by 1944 was a refined, sophisticated operation supported by extensive electronic warfare and fighter escorts. Experienced pilots and radar operators, the men who had perfected the deadly art of night fighting, were irreplaceable. When they died, their expertise died with them. Schnaufer, Becker, Drews, Lent. These men had years of experience. They understood the equipment, the tactics, the nuances of night combat. A replacement pilot with 50 hours of flying time couldn't replicate that knowledge. He would learn if he survived long enough. Most didn't, yet they kept flying. Through 1944 and into 1945, as Germany collapsed, Bf 110 night fighters continued to launch into the darkness. The odds were impossible. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if they couldn't say it openly. But still, they fought. Some fought out of loyalty to their comrades. Others fought because they'd been fighting for so long they didn't know how to stop. Some fought because they genuinely believed they were defending their families and homes from destruction. The motivations were complex, personal, and often contradictory. But the result was the same. They kept flying. April 1945. The Reich was dying. Soviet armies closed from the east, street by street through Berlin. Allied armies drove from the west, encountering minimal resistance as German forces collapsed. German cities were rubble. The government was fragmenting. Hitler was in his bunker, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, expecting victories that would never come. And in the night skies, a handful of Bf 100s still hunted British bombers, still tried to defend what little remained. It was futile, tragic, and somehow magnificent. These men knew they couldn't win. They knew the war was over. They flew anyway. The last Bf 110 combat missions were flown in the war's final days. Some units flew ground attack sorties in desperation, trying to slow the Allied advance. With Allied fighters dominating the skies, these missions were suicide. Bf 110's, designed as fighters, were attacking tanks and artillery with small bombs and machine guns. The results were predictable. Most didn't return. Other units continued night fighter operations until there was no fuel, no ammunition, or no aircraft left. When the end came, surviving Bf 100s were destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. or abandoned at airfields that were about to be overrun. Some crews flew their aircraft west, surrendering to American or British forces rather than the Soviets. Others simply walked away, leaving their aircraft behind, heading home to find whatever remained of their families. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Bf 110's war was over. The Zerstörer force, which had begun the war with such confidence and ambition, ended it exhausted, depleted, and defeated. The aircraft that was supposed to sweep the skies clean of enemies had itself been swept away by the tide of history. After the war, Allied intelligence studied the Bf 110 night fighter campaign extensively. They were stunned by its effectiveness. RAF Bomber Command had lost nearly 8,000 aircraft during the war. Many fell to night fighters, and the Bf 110 was responsible for a significant portion of those losses. The aircraft, dismissed as a failure in 1940, had become one of the most effective defensive weapons Germany possessed. The statistics were sobering. At its peak effectiveness in 1943 and early 1944, the German night fighter force was inflicting unsustainable casualties on RAF bomber streams. If the casualty rate had continued, Bomber Command might have had to abandon or significantly curtail night operations. Only the introduction of new countermeasures, escort fighters, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies eventually broke the German night fighter force. The stories that emerged from captured Bf 110 crews were remarkable. These men had adapted, improvised, and refined their tactics under impossible conditions. They had taken an aircraft designed for offensive operations and transformed it into a defensive weapon that had nearly broken the British bombing campaign. Hauptmann Wilhelm Herget, who scored 72 night victories, most in Bf 100s, described the strange intimacy of night combat. You never saw your opponent except as a shape in the darkness. You tracked him on radar, positioned yourself with mathematical precision, and fired. Often, you never knew if the men inside had families, dreams, fears. They were just targets, silhouettes against the night sky. Only after the war, speaking with former RAF bomber crews at reunions and commemorations, did the full horror of what he'd done truly hit him. These weren't just targets. They were men like him. Young men, far from home, terrified, doing their duty, and he'd killed them. 72 times, he'd sent men falling from the sky in flames. The fact that it was war, that it was legal, that he'd been decorated for it, didn't make it easier to process. Many German night fighter aces struggled with similar feelings after the war. They'd been heroes, celebrated, decorated. Now, they were just men trying to live with what they'd done. Some, like Schnaufer, never spoke publicly about their wartime experiences. Others, like Herget, eventually shared their stories, hoping that by confronting the past, they could make some kind of peace with it. The Bf 110 also had an unexpected role in Germany's final months. As Allied fighters achieved total air superiority, daylight operations became suicide for any German aircraft. But Bf 100s, equipped with night fighter modifications, could operate in twilight and darkness, making them valuable for reconnaissance and liaison missions when nothing else could fly safely. One little-known mission involved Bf 100s evacuating high-value personnel and documents from Berlin as the Soviet army closed in. Flying at night, navigating by dead reckoning with no radio navigation aids, often at low altitude to avoid detection, these aircraft slipped through Allied air defenses to reach Bavaria and other areas not yet overrun. It was a far cry from the glory days of 1940, but it demonstrated the versatility and durability of Messerschmitt's design. Even at the end, when everything was falling apart, the Bf 110 was still flying, still useful, still doing jobs that needed doing. The sound of a Bf 110 was distinctive. The two Daimler-Benz DB601 engines, later replaced by the more powerful DB605s, created a deep, rumbling roar. They were powerful 12-cylinder engines, and when both were running at full,